Hello. This lecture is my second one on reductionism. The first one presented arguments in favor of reductionism, whereas this one will present some arguments against the possibility of true reductionism in the sciences. And it's based on this interesting essay by Jerry Fodor, The Special Sciences, which we'll get back to in a little bit. First of all, remember that reductionism is the idea that you can take some kind of theory or phenomenon that's out there in the world that we can see and experience and completely explain it in terms of its underlying parts, the things that make it happen. Ultimately, the real ultimate goal of reductionism would be to explain everything just in terms of fundamental particles. So it'd be from a physics perspective. You can't really reduce any further down than that. That's sort of the fundamental building blocks of the universe. So if reductionism really works, like the real ultimate goal of a reductionist is to explain all of science, everything that we can understand and explain in terms of the natural sciences, explain it all just in terms of physics. So uh, recall from that other lecture, the overall argument in favor of reductionism is based on causation, that a true scientific explanation of things should be a causal explanation. And so it takes some fairly common sense premises from the sciences that everything is ultimately composed of these fundamental particles, and causation is ultimately accounted for by these particle interactions. A proper scientific explanation is a causal explanation, so therefore a proper scientific explanation should always ultimately, in the long run, ideally, be in terms of interacting fundamental particles. There's another way of describing reductionism that I talked about in that other lecture, and it's based on this distinction between types and tokens. So a type, as I described there, is a category of things. So there are electrons. Of course, there are lots of electrons. And electrons are a kind of thing, a type of thing that exists in the natural world. Same thing with photons and atoms and cells, trees, stars, mountains, all these different things that exist in the world that we can categorize into different groups. A token, on the other hand, is one specific instance of something that belongs to a certain type. So, for example, we might talk about a specific atom that we're studying somehow, or a particular tree that's there outside my window that belongs to a type of thing, trees. But now, when I'm at the token level, I'm talking about that specific tree right there in front of me. Or stars. There's lots of different stars. They all belong to the type stars, but there's one specific star that we orbit, our sun, and so that's a particular token of the type stars. So reductionism, that is another way of describing reductionism in terms of types and tokens, is that every type that's involved in a particular theory, say in biology or in psychology or sociology or ecology or economics, if we consider economics a science. Every type in that theory that we're trying to reduce is replaced by types in the reducing theory, ultimately types in physics. So we can use the types in physics and how they behave and interact with each other to give a complete explanation for what's happening at all the other levels of science that are above physics. But as I said, this lecture is really presenting arguments against reductionism that so far I've really just re-explained the basics of reductionism that were included in that other lecture. So there are at least two kinds of arguments against reductionism. One would be just to say that there are certain things that we believe that exist that just are completely independent of physics, or at least like not fully dependent on physics. That is, they involve some kind of causation beyond the causation that's happening at the level of these fundamental physical particles. They may even be non-physical things that we're talking about. So we'll get back to those in a second. But the other kind of anti-reductionism argument is to say that, well, even when we're just considering physical things, so we're not considering, causation beyond physical interactions or sort of non-physical entities of whatever kind, even when we're just talking about regular physical things, that could be that some types in higher level theories just cannot be reduced to types in physics without some kind of loss of critical information or critical understanding or ability to explain what's going on. So the idea there is that while all tokens are physical, right? We're talking about physical things here in the part B of the anti-reductionism. So all things are physical that we're talking about, but not all types can be reduced to just physical types. So let's go into more detail into each of these, starting with the first one. So some things are independent of physics. Obviously, some candidates might be divine or supernatural beings. They are supernatural, so they're not regular natural, right? They're not regular physical. They're somehow non-physical, the beyond the physical, completely separate from this idea of reducing things down to fundamental physical particles. It could be that consciousness, our conscious minds themselves, are in some sense independent of the underlying physical brain. It seems like we need a brain to have consciousness, as far as we know, but it could be that our consciousness is something above and beyond merely the neurons and so on that are going on inside of our brains. A less popular notion today, but one that used to be popular, was this idea that there's a life force that animates the basic physical matter that makes up our bodies and makes up the bodies or the parts of all the living organisms that exist. They all have a physical part to them, but they're imbued with some kind of non-physical life force that animates them and makes them be alive. Now, as maybe you already read ahead or were thinking on your own, that it's not clear to what extent these are really scientific ideas. In fact, traditionally within science, these are kind of rejected as non-scientific. They're perceived frequently by scientists as leading to sort of magical thinking, things that can't be tested at all and maybe are just sort of outside the purview of science and maybe shouldn't even be taken seriously by scientists. So, moving on to consciousness, that is something that is very much taken seriously by scientists. There's no doubt, really, no serious doubt, that consciousness actually exists, that we have minds, while there might be some doubt among scientists about whether a divine being exists or those sorts of things. But our minds, our conscious minds, seem to exist, right? That's one of the few things that I'm absolutely sure of, is that I am a conscious thinking being. So perhaps some might say consciousness is not actually reducible to the physical brain, which are neurons, the synapses, and the neurotransmitters moving around, the electrical activity, all of that, that maybe consciousness cannot be reduced all the way to physics. And there's a few reasons why people might think this. Think of it this way. We've got this blue background for these slides here. That blue background looks a certain way to you. Now, we could take a device, some kind of a measuring device, and measure the actual wavelength of the light that's coming from that blue background, and we'd give a certain number of nanometers for the wavelength. But there's also just the way blue looks to us, right? The way that wavelength of electromagnetic radiation appears to us when it comes into our eyes and triggers our photoreceptors and is kind of registered in our brains as a conscious visual experience. So we can ask, why does that particular wavelength of light appear to us the way it does? Why doesn't it appear some other way? I mean, it does appear to us in a certain way, right? But why that way? Why not some other way? Plus, and this is one that maybe more people have thought of before, do other people see blue the same way that I see blue? Is there any way that we can study individual people's brains and how their neurons are firing to be able to tell whether everybody perceives blue in the same way, or if different people perceive blue in slightly different ways. The thought is that there's not really anything that we can study about the brain itself, about the physical properties of the brain, that's going to be able to tell us why blue looks the way it does. Why doesn't it look some other way? Why, or does blue look the same way from one person to another? Now, we might find very dramatically different kinds of wiring in some people's brains than other people's brains, especially wiring that has to do with visual perception. And that might make us think that possibly that person is perceiving blue differently than another person when their brain wiring is quite different in their visual cortex. But it doesn't guarantee that that's the case. It could be that the wiring is somewhat different, but the perception of the color is actually the same from one person to another. We don't have any way of independently verifying that one way or the other. There's a famous essay by Thomas Nagel. It's actually the first philosophy essay I ever read that got me interested in this stuff. Um, and the title of the essay is, "What is it like to be a bat?" And by a bat, he means the animal bat, not a baseball bat. So remember that bats perceive the world primarily through sonar. It's actually a myth that they're blind. They do see a little bit, but their primary sensory system is for understanding their environment is sonar, so echolocation. So you could study everything that is possible to study about bat vocalizations, bat ears, bat hearing, bat brains, how their brains process that auditory information as it bounces off their environment and gives them a sense of where things are and how far away it all is and so on. You could study all of that exhaustively, every single physical detail about bats and their brains and how they process that information, and still not really know what it's like to be a bat. There's something else there, the conscious experience that the bat has from the bat's own point of view. Of course, like I said, they're using sonar. So when they pick up on this information of their surroundings, when they perceive their surroundings, what is that perception actually like? Is it like hearing, since it's sound waves? If so, it's a lot different than our kind of hearing. We don't hear in this kind of detailed three-dimensional way to where we could actually navigate through the world and dodge obstacles in this very, very fine-tuned way. We can't do that with our hearing. So if it's hearing, then it's a lot different than our hearing. So maybe it's more like vision for them, perhaps, but it's not using light, it's using sound. So it seems like it's got to be very different than our sense of vision. How do we know? Maybe it's something completely different than either hearing or vision from our perspective. We don't really know. We can understand sort of how the bat does what it does, but we can't know what it's like from the bat's perspective. So there's something about the bat, right? There's something about the bat mind and its perceptual experiences that are just, it's just not reducible to the underlying physical parts of the bat itself. Some other considerations here, we could talk just about humans and say like, well, suppose you meet a colorblind person, or even more dramatically, a completely blind person, especially somebody who's been blind from birth. Could they learn what it's like to perceive this color of blue that's part of the background on my slides here? How could you explain that to them? What sort of physical information, or even non-physical, any kind of information, could you give to them to really allow them to understand what it's actually like to know what blue looks like to fully sighted, color sighted people? There just doesn't seem to be anything that you can give them. They could study human brains and human retinas and photoreceptors all they want, and they will never really know what it's like to see the color blue. So again, that suggests that the perception of color, the conscious perception of color, is not reducible to physics. It's not reducible to just physics information that you can explain completely just through particle interactions and have a full understanding of what vision actually is and what consciousness actually is just from particle interactions. Similar consideration, we know some other animals can see wavelengths other than what we can see, whether it's infrared or ultraviolet. And again, we can study those animals as much as we want, and we'll never really know what ultraviolet looks to them or what infrared looks like to them. Okay, I think the point is made here, right? So that's for consciousness. Knowing all the biological, chemical, physical facts, it just can't tell you what the consciousness is like, although we are completely sure, at least especially in our own cases, for myself, I know absolutely for sure that consciousness is real. It's a thing that exists in the world. But I can do as much scientific studying of it as I want, and I can never really get a full understanding of it if I try to reduce it all just to physics. Okay. Now, there are some interesting theories about consciousness and its relationship to the physical brain. I'll be doing a separate lecture that focuses just on that. So feel free to take a look at this here as a little bit of a preview, but for now, I'm just going to move on. Okay, so the other argument against reductionism sets aside anything that might be kind of non-physical or anything having to do with consciousness directly, and can think just in terms of things that are physical. So the physical things, the seemingly purely physical things in the world, these seem like really good candidates for reduction all the way down to particle interactions, that we can give a full scientific explanation for trees and mountains and stars and biology, all just in terms of physics. That's the ultimate goal of reductionism. And so these things seem like a really good candidate. But here we're going to get an argument that says that even that may not actually be possible. So these things that we're going to be talking about are still compatible with current scientific theories. We're not talking about divine beings or mysterious life forces or something like that. We're just dealing with sort of familiar stuff within science. Remember this distinction between a type and a token. A type is a category of things, stars, planets, and so on, whereas a token is a specific instance of that type. The argument here is going to be that some types of things are independent of any physical composition. Now, any particular token is going to be made of something, right? So every token is physical, so it's made of physical stuff. But at the category level, can't be completely explained just in terms of physics. Another way of saying this is that, and this will become clearer, hopefully, as we go through the rest of the explanation, some types have multiple realizations. So that is, they have tokens that are made of different kinds of things, but still belong to the same type. So let's look at some examples. The first couple here might not be really great examples. We can talk about atoms being multiply realizable. When we say that something is realized, we're saying like, oh, there's a certain type of thing, but then a token is a realization. That is a specific instance. There it is. It's manifest, right? It's a physical manifestation of something that belongs in that particular type. So an atom. Well, there's lots of different kinds of atoms that have different numbers of protons, neutrons, and electrons. You might say, well, okay, but they're still all protons, neutrons, and electrons. So is that really multiply realizable, different tokens of atoms? Maybe. Molecules, perhaps a better candidate here. Molecules can be made of lots and lots of different types of atoms that are bonded together in different ways. So maybe, but they all belong to this category, this type, molecule. But again, they're all still made of atoms. Well, then when we get to genes, things maybe get a little tougher. So a gene is a segment of DNA, roughly speaking, a segment of DNA that contains the information for making at least one protein. So we might say, well, every gene is made of DNA. Maybe, based on the biology that we're familiar with, if we encountered some new life forms and they stored their biological information in a way that was very, very similar to the way that our life stores biological information, but it just didn't use DNA, it used some other complex polymer, we might still say that that other form of life is using genes, but not DNA. So genes then would be multiply realizable in these different forms. Now we're going to get more dramatic as we go through the list here. Cells, lots of different kinds of cells. Even within, certainly at the high level, we've got animal cells, plant cells, bacteria cells, archaea, so on. Very different kinds of cells than even within one of those big categories. Animal cells, lots and lots of different cells, that varieties there, from neurons to skin cells to muscle cells, very radically different, but they all belong in the same category of cell. Planets, right? That's a natural type of thing. That's something that exists in the world, independent of our sort of interest in categorizing things. Even if there were no humans around to categorize things, there would still be planets, these things that are out there. But there's small rocky planets, there's gas giants, and different sorts of planets like that. So planets seem to be multiply realizable. Mountain too, lots of different rocks that could be put together to make a mountain. Life, I already kind of talked about this when I was talking about genes. Life on Earth, known life, seems to come in many, many different forms, but especially if we find life elsewhere in the universe, maybe within our own solar system, that has a different origin, might have very different chemical composition, its metabolism is quite different, so it's just a different sort of life, but it still belongs in that general type of life, of living things. Hearts, they pump blood. There's lots of different ways that you can pump blood, and still the blood pumping mechanism will still be a heart. Same thing with brains. They can construct brains in many different ways. Again, especially if we find other life forms that have brains, they might be constructed very differently than ours. Mind, that goes back to the issue of consciousness, that could be very multiply realizable. Food, that's a recognizable type of thing that's very important in biology, but it comes in so many different forms, from fats and proteins and carbohydrates and so on, put together in all different ratios. There's so many different examples of food that are very different from one another, but they all belong to the same category. Ecosystems, right? Many, many, many different kinds of ecosystems. So in some cases with almost no overlapping organisms at all, but they're still ecosystems, right? Ecosystem A has completely different set of organisms from ecosystem B, but they're still ecosystems. Money, now we're getting to something that's more of a human invention, but it still is an important type that's used in many different explanations, especially within economics. And I'm focusing on this here because this is something that Jerry Fodor is going to use in his argument against reductionism. So money clearly is multiply realizable. Governments, very multiply realizable. Many different sorts of governments, many different ways of setting up governments, certainly different people involved in different governments. So a government is multiply realizable as well. Okay, I think I've explained this long enough. So here comes Jerry Fodor. Many of these, maybe all of the types that we had on the previous slide, cannot be fully accounted for by just types in physics. Now, he's not going to say that it's useless to talk about the underlying physics. We can understand a lot. Physics has had great success. Science in general has had great success in understanding the underlying physical instantiations, what's going on at the chemical level, at the particle level, for all of these tokens that are involved in these scientific processes or in these natural processes. I'll go back to the previous slide. Understanding the atoms that are involved in making up genes and cells and planets and hearts and brains and food and so on. It's very helpful to understand what these things are made of. What Fodor is saying, though, is that it's not a complete explanation. We get an interesting giant chunk of the explanation for these things, for these types, but we don't get the full explanation. There's more to the explanation than just the underlying physical realization. So if we put it into sort of premise and conclusion form here, although it looks a bit complicated, we can start off by something pretty simple, using the example of money that I mentioned before. It's an important type in monetary theory and economic theories of various kinds. And every individual monetary exchange involves some physical event that includes some specific token, maybe more than one token, of money, more than some token of this type, money. And obviously, there's a huge diversity of possible tokens that can be included in this type money. Certainly cash, right? Whether it's paper money or coins or whatever, even that is multiply realizable. Cash, that as a concept, right, as a type itself is multiply realizable. Checks, if anybody uses checks still, maybe they're more likely to use something like PayPal or Bitcoin even. That's what, electrons in the cloud or something. So that's very different realization, very different tokens than cash or checks. Certainly credit cards, whether it's the physical sort of plastic rectangle, or again, it's sort of the electrons flying around in computer systems. Wire transfer, or if we go kind of back into the olden days, we could talk about gold or jewels or even something like clamshells that people might use as money. So massively diverse set of tokens that can all belong to the single type of money. But this type money is certainly necessary for economic theory in order to explain what's happening in economics and why it's happening. It's not sort of the only concept, of course, but it's an important central concept in economics. So if we tried to do a full reduction, right, go all the way down to the level of particle interactions for this type money, we would have this ridiculous diversity of tokens. We'd have to include every possible token of money. Certainly the things that I have here on this list, but all the other things that aren't on this list that could also be used as money. We'd have to include all of those. And from the perspective of physics, if we do that full reduction all the way down, all the tokens of money and bring them all the way down to particle physics, somebody else coming in and looking at this explanation just in terms of particle physics, they'd see this insane diversity of different arrangements of particles and these particles interacting in this very dramatically diverse set of ways. It would just look like a big chaotic mess. They wouldn't recognize this chaotic mess as a single type. The only thing that unifies this diverse set of tokens into a single type is this higher level concept of money. The only unifying factor, as I say here, is that they all belong to this type under the circumstances in which they're being used in monetary transactions. That is just, you just can't capture that at the level of physics. So, therefore, Fodor concludes, an adequate explanation of monetary exchanges still requires this higher level concept of money. You can't talk about it just in terms of the underlying particle interactions. So, therefore, the type money just cannot be reduced to physics without a very dramatic loss of explanatory power. The significance of money and how it's used and why it happens is just gone. And so this is true, so his argument goes, right? He used money as his central example initially because he thinks that's a really obvious example of something that can't be reduced all the way down to physics. But then he goes on to say that this is true for many types at these higher levels, that things like the feelings of pain or pleasure or happiness or our thoughts and our ideas, our willpower, emotions, or these biological types like organisms, just reproduction as a process, the idea of food and waste products, species and other categories of organisms, whole ecosystems or biomes. These things, if we understand the underlying physics, we can get extra insight, we can understand them better, but we just can't get a complete scientific explanation or a complete scientific understanding of these things if we're only going to be talking about them at this lowest possible level of particle interactions. There's just too many different tokens involved in these types. And this diverse set of tokens just has nothing to unify them other than that higher level concept. So that higher level concepts just can't be reduced to physics. So that's the overall uh, set of arguments against reductionism. We lose the context if we reduce all the way to physics. We lose the reasons why these things are happening, and why these sort of seemingly chaotic, diverse set of patterns of particle interactions are working out the way that they're working out. Like, why are they going together in this way? Why is any of this happening? So the motivations and meanings and intentions, certainly those are sort of conscious things having to do with minds. So at the level of consciousness, we really can't explain things just in terms of the underlying physics. All right, that's that for this one. See you at the next lecture.